Jim Walker with Major League predictions for standings.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm the regular version. The odd one isn't here today, but this is a project that draws out of a lot of our projects. Draws out of friendships we've had over the years with people, and so a little background. A good friend of mine, Rob Bellamy, who's the co-author on this, and his work is just as important in mine as anything I present today. He and I, for many, many years this spring, would always do what we call the picks, right? And the picks were pretty simple. We'd get a napkin or wherever we happened to be at the time, and just before the season would start, we would write down how we expected each team in each division to wind up at the end of the season, right? And then we had a real simple system where at the end of the season we would do the accounting. If your team was first, the team you picked first finished last, you subtract that and you get a number, right? And so the worst you could do in a 5-team would be -4, and you did that for every pick. And at the time, this goes back so far that it was the Montreal Expos, and we learned very quickly, never pick the Montreal Expos to finish either first or last, right? Never. Always pick them to finish in the middle, because they are the most unpredictable team, right? So we would have the Montreal Expo. So we did that for years, and then we'd have a bet. And since Rob isn't here, I can tell you in all truthfulness, I usually won the bet. He might have a different interpretation, but that's the way I remember it. And so we'd buy each other lunch. So we were fishing around for ideas, and we said, you know, lots of people do this in the spring. Lots of publications do this every spring, right? And like most predictions, they're basically out there just to create some interest, a few clicks on the web, or maybe sell a few publications or contribute to that, and get a few dollars coming in. And at the end of the season, virtually no one ever goes back and looks to see how they predicted. At most, if somebody's predicting the World Series, they might go back and look at this, but they don't look at their actual standings picks. And we never predicted postseason. We never predicted the World Series, because we always felt like in a short season, there's really not quite as much skill there. There's a lot of luck and unpredictability when you're playing 5 games or 7 games. But we really wanted to look at 162 games, a real season. You should be, if you're a prognosticator, able to do something with that. So it became a sort of quest with ours, and we've done this essentially in sort of 3 stages, and I'll go over all of them today. I wrote up a couple of pieces for a publication called The Conversation. I did one last spring and the previous spring based on our work. And I'm kind of going in chronological order. So let me see if I can get this go. There's our names. And we'll start with a little Yiddish here. I won't begin to pronounce this or anything, but it's an old Yiddish proverb, and roughly translated, or usually translated as, man plans, God laughs. Okay? The sense is that there's an unpredictability to life. Okay? And if we apply that to predictions, we can say that's probably true about Major League Baseball as well, or predictions and forecasts. We started with a 6-year study. And we tried to get a hybrid of online and traditional print publications. Some of them very old line, been doing this for a long time, some of them much more recent. And our initial study was a 6-year study, and we looked at the predictions made just for the standings, not for the World Series, just the final standings in each division in baseball. Looked at Sports Illustrated, Sporting News, ESPN the Magazine, Advance Sports, New York Times, Baseball Prospectus, ESPN.com, Yahoo.com, and Bleacher Report. And why did we pick those? Because those are the ones I could find on the web. So that was real simple. Here are our research questions. I'll go through them quickly, and you'll get the results as we go through. And you'll see these again a little bit later in the presentation. We wanted to know what was the mean correlation between the predicted standings and the final standings for all publications for all years. And I'll go over correlation for those of you who aren't quantitatively inclined. It's a fairly simple statistic. And so we wanted to see how good were these predictors as a unit. We also wanted to know how much were they basically just using how the teams finished the previous year. Because I don't know about you, but if I'm sitting there and it's one of those divisions I don't pay a lot of attention to, right, there's a good chance I'm going to write in how the team finished the year before. And we all know that, you know, people tend to look at the most immediate results, right, and then use that forecast. What just happened seems to be a good way of predicting what's going to happen. We wanted to see if the professional predictors were doing that as well. We obviously wanted to ask the question, who did the best job of predicting? And were there big differences among publications, or were they all pretty much the same? Who did the worst? We wanted to know, is there a difference between online and print publications? Did traditional print publications do a little better or newer online? You might say services that are a little newer and therefore maybe less tradition bound. Perhaps they did a little better job. We wanted to look at over time, we only had a 6-year time here, but of those years, which were the years that were particularly hard to predict? Were certain years easy to predict, certain years hard to predict, or were all years pretty much the same? We wanted to see what teams during this period of time were the easiest to predict, and which teams were the hardest to predict, which ones did the forecasters do the best job with. And just basically we wanted to say how good were predictions. All right, evaluated by correlation, this is the statistical explanation. If you're not into correlation, it's pretty straightforward and simple. Correlation between the predicted standing for each team in Major League Baseball's 6 divisions and the final standings for each year. Best possible prediction is 1. Worst possible prediction, if you got them all in absolutely reversed order, whoever finished first, finished last, and so forth, right? If you did that, absolutely the worst you could possibly do for all 6 divisions taken together, you would have a -1 correlation. Okay, 1 would be perfect. You got them. You nailed every single one of them in the correct order for every division. You would get a 1 if you did that. All right. All sources, all years. This is putting all 6 together. The prediction was positive. Remember, it can go down to -1, right? It was 0.49. Okay, which, if you're into statistics, 0.49 is considered a pretty good correlation for most things. Now, it depends on the thing you're studying, but it's not a trivial correlation. Another way to look at that is that it accounts for about 25% of the variation in the standings. So in other words, about 25% is understood through their predictions, and about 75% is random chance mystery. Okay, but 0.49 is a pretty decent prediction, not outstanding, but pretty decent. Okay, we looked at our different sources, and then we went back, and the second question we had is, well, how much were they simply relying on what they did the previous year? And one of the things we found is that the sources, all of them taken together, were tending to rely pretty heavily on how the teams had finished the previous year. Now that's not illogical, right? A team that did very well in one year is likely to do fairly well in the next year, and a team that did very poorly is likely to do very poorly, right? So it's not illogical that you would do that, okay? Generally speaking, the correlation was a little bit higher here, and it showed that most of our predictors were certainly using how the teams had finished the prior year. Of the online sources, here are the breakdowns. ESPN.com hit right at the average. 0.49, that's what, if you take the total average. Yahoo.com was just slightly less. Bleacher Reports, slightly less than them. And actually, interestingly enough, the sort of gold standard for forecasting that we all use, and I know when I play fantasy baseball, I use their forecasts all the time in helping to pick my team. In this case, Baseball Prospectus did the poorest. But again, these are very, very small differences. You know, 100th of a point in a correlation is really a trivial difference. I mean, it'd be fair to say that these were really pretty much all tied, right? They're not that far apart. Print sources actually did the best. And for any of you old-timers here, the Sporting News did the best predicting. They were 0.53 of all our sources. Sports Illustrated was 0.51. New York Times tied them at 0.51. At the Unsports was 0.50. Okay, and ESPN, the magazine, the newest of the publications, did the poorest. Again, this is only 6 years, right? Yeah, good. And the differences aren't great. Okay. Now, here's what the most interesting thing I think in this initial study came up. Just to remind you, all sources taken together, all of them lumped together, their prediction score correlation was 0.49. All online sources, 0.47. All print sources did slightly better, 0.50. This is the yearly breakdown. Sorry, I couldn't put this up. All sources, and you can look at the years. And as you think through these years, you can remember the standings of these particular years. You might kind of think, why was there variation here? 2014, 0.40. 2013, 0.53. 2012, 0.48. 2011, 0.45. And the outlier is 2010, 0.26. Anybody remember the 2010 season?
The Giants won the World Series.
Okay, they won the World Series. Any other surprising teams? Because typically when you have this sort of thing, you've got some surprises. You've got some teams that tanked, everybody expected to do well, and you have some teams that did very well that everybody was expecting to do poorly. Generally speaking, that would be younger teams rising, but not in the case of the Cubs this year, where people were clearly anticipating it last year and this year, but teams that no one was anticipating. So some yearly variations. 2009 was probably the best year. Easiest team to predict during this 6-year period of time. Now think of this run. 6-year period, the Pirates. Any speculation why the Pirates were particularly easy to predict?
They were poor, but they were young and they were getting better.
They were bad and had been bad for a long time, right? So it was pretty easy to predict them get bad, to get better. And it's only just at the end of this that they're starting to get good again. Okay? So a bad team, it does seem to be a pattern that a bad team is one of the easiest things to predict. That if somebody is bad, they're likely to be bad the next year. Phillies, probably just the opposite, right? The Phillies were just ending that really, really strong run, right? It's certainly over now, right? And as you recall, Ruben Amaro was criticized soundly for going too long with that old team, right? But in fact, he had been successful, so it was a pretty easy team to predict. Cubs.
Bad.
Well, predictably good at the beginning of the run and predictably bad at the end of the run.
Exactly. The team, everybody could see the point where the team was likely to collapse, right? And they went with that, and they were right. The team did collapse, right? And in fact, given the nature of a full rebuild underway, it's easy to predict that the collapse was going to definitely happen, right? And they were at least within predictable range. Again, these aren't perfect predictions, but they're pretty strong. 0.79. And the Royals round out the list here, the Nationals. Nationals, I think, again, because they were, at this point, still a relatively new team, and generally in the early phases of this, they were just going to be poor, right? But then they clearly signed some premium players and began to switch around. Hardest teams to predict? The Blue Jays. Minus 0.79. Remember, -1 would be completely backwards every year. So this is literally, a team that can't be predicted. This means that the Blue Jays, when everyone thought they were going to do well, did badly, and when everybody thought they were going to do badly, they did well. Think of the division that they're in, right? A very, very competitive division with a lot of teams loading up on free agents. So the volatility of that division might be very, very strong. Look at it this year, right? And even the last 2 or 3 years. Diamondbacks. I don't know if you follow the Diamondbacks or look at them, but this is a franchise that goes up and down. If what you did was for those 6 years, write in the previous year's standings into your prediction, your correlation would be 0.49, which means if you simply took last year's standings, used them to predict the coming year's standings, you would be doing as well as our 9 sources did, our 9 expert sources did over these 6 years. Now that's a bit of a coincidence that they'd be exactly the same correlation. But it kind of tells you that the expert knowledge in this case doesn't really amount to very much. And God laughed. So it had to be my computers. All right. Addendum. We tried to say, okay, 6 years is 6 years. Let's look a little bit longer period of time. And so we first expanded this by looking back to 2003. Because maybe this 6 years is an aberration, right? Let's see if these sources can do better. We didn't do all the sources because of course some of these are online sources that didn't exist this far back. We looked at the Sporting News, Sports Illustrated, New York Times, baseball. Sporting News had the strongest correlation once again, but you notice it's a little bit stronger over time, right? Some of the variation levels out and they become a little bit better at predicting. Sports Illustrated was number 2, New York Times tied it. Baseball Prospectus was very, very close as well. So very little difference whenever you start to look over a longer stretch of time. And God laughs, just not quite as loud when we look over 12 years. All right, that was our first year. Okay, the second year we tried to say, okay, this is interesting, but what started to become interesting to us is, does predictability change? What are factors that lead to some things becoming more predictable or less predictable? And so we started to look at long-term standings in Major League Baseball over a long haul. And we sort of mined our data sets. And of course, when you're talking about long-term prediction, you have to start with sources that have been doing this for a while, right? And the ones we came up with were the Sporting News and Sports Illustrated, okay? Because they've been doing predictions, and sometimes you have to kind of read between the lines to figure them out, but you can basically do them. And then a good friend of ours happened to have Street and Smith's baseball guides and had a wonderful collection of those. And so he was able to give us all the predictions from Street and Smith's from 1955 on. So we took 1955 on because we thought, first of all, we would get a much greater data set so we'd have a better sense of what predictability really looks like. But also, we would get a sense of differences and changes. Think of all of the structural changes in Major League Baseball since 1955. Okay, how many teams were there in Major League Baseball in 1955?
16.
Okay. How many teams are there now?
30.
How many divisions, leagues were there in 1955? Okay, you got it, right? So there should be some changes over time. Did free agency exist in 1955? Of course not, right? So we know a lot of things have changed in baseball. And we only had Street and Smith's from 1962 to 2007, so the short run publication ends in 2007, at least in terms of these predictions. Search questions, I won't go over these because we basically did the same thing. Evaluation correlations, we'll skip that. All right, so let's take a look at these. Now, one of the things that we did have to deal with is what it means to make predictions. Okay, if I'm confronted with predictions today, I'm confronted with basically making 5 choices in 6 different divisions, right? So I can pick 1 to 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I do that 6 times. When I was making predictions in 1955, I basically had 2 sets of predictions, but it was 1 to 8, right? So one of the things that we factored into this was the difficulty of predictions, right? And the way we did that was pretty simple. We figured out what would be the maximum wrong you could get in any particular year. And that's figured out by taking, what if you pick the first place team last, right? What would be the maximum you could miss wrong? And we did that at each step of the way and came up with a composite score. So that's when you see adjusted mean, that's probably the more accurate correlation. 1955 to 1960, the last stable period where there were 16 teams and 2 leagues. Sports Illustrated had a mean correlation of 0.678. The Sporting News slightly weaker at 0.624. Street and Smith, we didn't have the data for that, so they're not included. But an overall mean of 0.65. The adjusted mean drops that down because making predictions in that arena is simply easier, right? There's only 16 teams, there's only 2 leagues.
And one of them is the Yankees.
And one of them is the Yankees.
And the other is the Dodgers.
That's the Dodgers, right? Oh, you'll see that. So yeah, that probably helps a little bit too. 1961 to 68, for the first permutation of free agency. Remember, we do have 1 year there where there's one team with, or one league with 9 teams and one league with 10 teams, right? Or excuse me, 8 teams, 10 teams, right? And then 62 comes along. So we figured that in there a little bit. Prediction becomes a lot harder there, right? Because if you really mess up, let's say you pick a team second and they wind up finishing 9th, that's a huge hit, right? Your correlation is going to suffer quite a bit from that. So adjusting for the mean. The raw mean you saw drops off, right? Which is not surprising because the predictions are harder, right? The overall average is here, and we can get our street smiths in here as well. If we adjust the mean, though, taking into the fact that this is a lot harder to make these predictions, in fact, the correlation becomes about the strongest we've ever seen. Okay. Interestingly, the Yankee effect kind of drops off about the middle of this point, right? In 64, 65 is the year things start to change. Okay. 69 to 76, expansion era, but no free agency, or at least no significant free agency effects at this point. We see predictability drops off a little bit. Adjusted mean back pretty much to 55-60 period. First real hit of free agency, and I point that out 77 to 92. I know free agency comes in at different times and you have to pay this, but at this point free agency is starting to become part of the package. And we see that the overall predictability drops in real terms and in adjusted terms pretty dramatically, at least in terms of these correlations for a long period of time. Okay, you still have some expansion going on here as well, but the biggest structural change in baseball that's happening during this time is the advent of free agency, right? And so we were asking ourselves, well, how's that affecting predictability? And one of the things that is also true about this is the pre-sabermetric period, right, where we don't really have the advanced kind of statistics that everyone is reading now. A lot of these columnists who are making these predictions now are looking at baseball prospectus. They know what WAR is. They're aware of it. There was probably a case in this period of time where predictors were overestimating the impact of free agency. Oh, we just signed the top pitcher, top starting pitcher, right? That team is suddenly going to go up quite dramatically. Whereas in fact now we know that unless it's Clayton Kershaw, right, one pitcher probably can't make that much difference. They can add 2 or 3 victories to a team, right? But they're not going to add 10 or 15 victories to a team. Probably have a much better evaluation going on now at this time. And so this is pure speculation, but our speculation is that free agency kicks in here, and the journalists really haven't adjusted to the real impact of free agency at this point. There is some expansion going on as well. And as somebody points out, the Yankees haven't gotten totally dominant yet, right? And so maybe it's for just jump up to 93, 97. We start to get a little bit better predictability, although not back to the peak period. And then if we look at the most recent period of time, after the sort of last round of expansion, 1998 to 2015, we see things starting to become more predictable. And again, just speculation, but our speculation is it's the fact that free agency is now reality. Maybe predictors have been burned a few times, so maybe exaggerating the impact of a trade or free agent acquisition, and they're being a little bit more conservative. Although I certainly see lots of evidence that they still do that. How many remember the San Diego Padres, predictions for San Diego Padres last year, or the Chicago White Sox last year, or this year for that matter, right? Being, let's say, a little optimistic in terms of how they actually wound up. So I think that's still going on. But you see it starts to get back. So it gets almost back to, if you will, the golden age of the 16-team league over time. So we were just curious in this long-term study is there's an ebb and flow here. You see though that things still tend to hover around that 0.50 period. I mean that seems to be the gold rule. If anything, these particular sources are even more dependent on the prior year's standings. You see, this is the correlation for Sports Illustrated between their prediction and the previous year's prediction, and you can see these are very high predictions, right? So definitely there's a pattern to looking to the previous year, and that doesn't seem to change. Okay, easiest teams to predict, hardest teams to predict. Remember, we're running from 1955. Obviously, some of these franchises that don't start until later, the Astros, for example. See any patterns here? These are the easiest teams to predict. All correlations approaching 1, right? All above 0.7. That's a very good correlation. Any patterns here?
When they were bad, they were bad. And when they were good, they were good, and they were good for a few years.
Right. But especially when they were bad for a very long time. Okay? Go back and look at the first few years of the Blue Jays. We all remember the first few years of the Mets, right? Astros, same thing. Now again, it's just a correlation over time. And it's probably also true when they made a transformation, they started to get good, they would stay good for a long time as well. But these were all expansion teams. The Athletics technically aren't an expansion team, but they always played like an expansion team. Mets, Blue Jays expansion team, and Mariners. Okay, so 4 of the 5 teams are expansion teams. So it's pretty clear that if you're going to predict something right, go with an expansion team. And the most difficult teams to predict. Lowest correlations. None of them are negative, by the way. They're all positive, so they aren't as bad as the Blue Jays were. But this is looking over the entire length of their franchise. Diamondbacks have been historically the worst franchise to predict. Okay, another one difficult to predict. Dodgers, Cardinals, Giants, Reds. Any pattern there?
I would say the last 4 are considered traditional powers, so they always thought that they were going to be better than maybe they turned out to be.
That would be my guess. You know, these are all old. These are like the oldest franchises in the National League, among the oldest franchises in the National League, right? Maybe there's a little bias, you know, towards them. Obviously, the expectation is they're going to do better when they don't. I don't know, but there is definitely a pattern in that you're going to be talking about 4 of the 8, you know, original National League franchises.
There's one there you could predict. That would be the Giants in an even year. If you go back to 2008 for the
Winning the World Series. Yeah, yeah. And again, those kinds of patterns we're not looking at. We're looking at sort of the broad.
And they can't figure it out because I was with Bruce Bochy at a cocktail thing on spring training. I asked him, he said, yes, why every other year deal happens, and they came in an odd year.
Well, and I think particularly, you know, as I said, I think if you're talking about predictability over a 162-game season, then there probably is quite a bit of knowledge and skill that goes into making some of those judgments. To knowing that a young team, right? First of all, knowing that that young team has some very good players and they're likely to come to fruition this year. Being able to make that prediction, that's one of the basic judgments. Or an old team is really going to collapse, that they finally are too old, right? The old Brent Rickey line, you know, I want to trade a player a year before, you know, rather than a year too soon rather than a year too late. So knowing when that is, there's some real skill in that, right? Yeah.
Why would you think they'd be all National League team?
Don't know. Could just be a coincidence. Don't know. I don't know, anybody have any ideas why it would turn out? I mean, I think I understand why they would be established, you know, long-term franchises. I think there's something to that. But why they would all happen to be. Obviously, the Yankees were so dominant in one team, but the Yankees turned out, I have to look at this stats list, but I think they were kind of middle of the pack. They were sort of middle of the pack too, as I think. Although they were good for a long stretch.
I thought they seemed to be a lot more Western than most of the other teams. Could it be that some of these predicting groups are more New York-based sports writers and have more knowledge of the New York area teams?
You know, I have to go back and look because you're really talking about a wide array of people. And some of the publications do it differently. Street Smith, basically they would get a working journalist, and that person might be from Chicago. I don't think there is quite as clear on New York biased in terms of the total configuration of people. And they don't seem to over-predict or under-predict the Yankees, for example, which would be, things. So I'm not quite sure I can read that into it. But why American League, National League, I can't believe it. Yeah.
There were a lot of predictions this year skewing in favor of the Giants because it was an even numbered year.
Right.
That seems like a bad tool.
And again, you could still predict somebody with the wild card, you can predict somebody to not win their division, right, and still win the World Series. So that's a possibility. Yeah, I think that's just a fluke. I mean, I think he doesn't have an answer because there isn't an answer. It's just a randomness.
Maybe retooling.
For example, the Cubs not winning since 1908. I mean, obviously, randomness, right? It has nothing to do with competency or skill.
In 1984, Bill James did his annual predictions, and he said, once again, the Cubs are 100-to-1 shot to win their division. If anybody offers you 100-to-1 odds on it, bet heavy, because they're really only a 15 or 25-to-1 chance against winning their division because the league is so compressed.
Yeah, and one of the things that has been asked of us, and I think I would be very interested if I could get a hold of the data set, is what did the predictions, and you don't necessarily have to have a ranking, you could just have expected number of games and you could make your ranking. In fact, some of these sources basically just predict the number of games they're going to win, and then you do the ranking based on that. But what about Las Vegas? How good are they, right, in terms of predictions of the number of games that they're going to win and the actual betting based on that? And I don't have access to that data, but I'd be very interested to see. Because there are people that are not just writing something for a column. And some people have pointed out, there's not much value in predicting something that's not a surprise if you're trying to sell publications, right? Predicting a surprise, gets you a lot more interest and a lot more play than predicting that, the Cardinals are going to be good.
Yeah, especially a publication like Sports Illustrated that kind of is on that. They try to put themselves on the cutting edge. So
This is Arizona's year.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the sporting news is going to tell you, probably give you the best. It gives you the best prediction because they're a baseball. That's a thing.
Yeah. Well, certainly for a long time, a long period of this time, they were the baseball only or the baseball specialized publication. They're certainly dominated baseball, and certainly we go back to the '55 period of time.
So if you were just picking randomly, you would presumably come up with 0?
Presumably
Like if you
over
were
a long
rolling
period of
dice
time,
to-
yeah, if you were just doing this randomly, it should come out with a 0 correlation. It shouldn't be especially unpredictable or especially predictable. Yeah, that's true. So if you're showing it like that Blue Jay thing, you're saying this is a weird team. This is not just a team that when they're bad they're doing good, but when you're expecting them to do good they're doing bad. I mean exactly the opposite, which is pretty hard to do, right? I think, but it seems to me there's an interesting analysis of each of these teams. And one of the things that I want to do, somebody mentioned this when we were talking earlier.